Thirdly, for his opening remarks.
Ms. Connie Dogart, President of Network 2020, Ambassador Raymond Burkhardt, President of Pacific Century Institute, members of the Diplomatic and the Consular Corps, moderator and the panelists, professors, scholars, friends from the media, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good evening. My name is Tom Jichang Lee. I'm the Director General of Taipei Economic and Cultural Office in New York. So on behalf of Teco New York, I want to welcome all of you. I know that there's a NCAA final basketball, and I think you think Taiwan is more important than NCAA. Thank you very much. And I also want to thank Network 2020 for co-host this important event. I think you all agree with me, Taiwan can play an important role in the US high-tech supply chain. Of course, there are several opportunities for Taiwan. First, Taiwan, we are famous for our manufacturing capabilities. United States is famous for branding and also the innovation. So, which means Taiwan and the US, we can complement each other. Taiwan, we are good at hardware, and the US, you are good at the software and the branding. So we too can make a very good partner. And secondly, Taiwan, we produce 90% of the high-end chips. And in this AI age, all the technologies you need chips. So Taiwan, I think we are important also in that area. But probably you don't know starting from January this year, there are some exciting developments between Taiwan and the US. First one, in January, Taiwan, we signed an investment MOU with the United States. And our companies, we pledge we are going to invest $250 billion in the US. And our government, our government is going to provide another $250 billion as a credit guarantee. So which means soon you are going to see probably more and more Taiwanese companies coming to the United States to invest. And also in February, Taiwan and the US, we signed an agreement of reciprocal trade. So Taiwan, we are going to work with the US to enhance our economic cooperation. And all those milestones reflect a partnership that is becoming more institutionalized and forward-looking. I want to quote our President Lai Ching-te, Taiwan and the United States are more than trade partners. We invest in each other, innovate together, and jointly safeguard economic security. And of course, at the same time, Taiwan, we are also facing some challenges, such as supply chain disruptions and geopolitical tensions. In addition, we are also having a big challenge because Taiwan, we haven't signed an agreement of avoidance of double taxation. And while our main competitors, such as other countries, Japan, Korea, they have signed. So, which means it may make Taiwanese companies a little bit more difficult to invest than our Asian friends. So, in concluding my remarks, I want to emphasize this year marks 250th anniversary of the United States. And this year also marks 30th 30th anniversary for Taiwan's first presidential election. So Taiwan, we share the same democratic values like the United States. And as a partner of the United States, Taiwan will continue to work together with the United States to promote shared prosperity and also to continue to be an important partner. Thank you very much for your attention.
Now, please join me in welcoming Ms. Doggett, President of Network 2020, for her opening remarks.
Hi, thank you everyone for being here. Thank you very much to Ambassador Lee and also Karen and Xiaoheng for all your help in this partnership with TECO. So just as Taiwan and the US have a wonderful partnership, I feel like TECO and Network 2020 have really developed a wonderful partnership over the years, and it's something that I really appreciate. I'm also so pleased to hold this discussion tonight. As I think we all know, we're living in a time when the boundaries between economic security and national security are increasingly blurred. And we're really, I think, seeing this in real time, whether it's different leverage points, whether it's the Strait of Hormuz or access to critical minerals. And one of those really important leverage points, I think, is chips. And so I'm so pleased to be able to have this conversation with a really amazing panel tonight. Network 2020, we aim to hold conversations like these throughout the year on all different topics. So if you're new to Network 2020, we encourage you to learn a little bit more because we can really see, I think, again, in real time, just how critical economic security is. And so, again, I want to thank Ambassador Lee and TECO for this fantastic partnership. And with that, I am going to wrap my remarks because I think we all really just want to hear from the panel. So thank you, everyone, for being here.
Okay. Now let's invite the panelists and moderator to take your seats. And without further ado, David Sachs, the floor is yours.
All right, thank you everybody. My name is David Sachs and I'm a fellow for Asia Studies at the Council on Foreign Relations here in New York. I have the easy job tonight of moderating this great panel, so I will just very briefly introduce them. I think fuller bios are in the program provided, but we'll just briefly introduce them and we'll get on our way. So on my far left here is Adam Segal, and he is the Ira A. Lippman Chair in Emerging Technologies and National Security and Director of the Digital and Cyberspace Policy Program at the Council on Foreign Relations. During the Biden administration, he served as a senior advisor in the State Department's Bureau of Cyberspace and Digital Policy, where he led the development of the United States International Cyberspace and Digital Policy. He is the author of The Hacked World Order: How Nations Fight, Trade, Maneuver, and Manipulate in the Digital Age, which describes the increasingly contentious geopolitics of cyberspace. To Adam's right is Rosalind Xue, who is a professor of political science at Temple University and a non-resident senior fellow at Taiwan's Research Institute for Democracy, Society, and Emerging Technology, which we refer to as DCET. She is an expert on states and markets, comparative regulation and governance, and development and globalization. She is the author most recently of the book Micro-Institutional Foundations of Capitalism: Sectoral Pathways to Globalization in China, India, and Russia. And to my immediate left is Stephen Ezell. He is the Vice President for Global Innovation Policy at the Information Technology and Innovation Foundation. He is an expert on science and technology policy, international competitiveness, trade, and manufacturing. He co-authored the book Innovating in a Science-Driven Economy: Insights, Application, and Practice, and also is the author of Innovation Economics: The Race for Global Advantage. So I will start with you, Stephen. So help us set the stage and lay the foundation for the rest of this conversation. How would you describe Taiwan's role in global high-tech supply chains?
Well, you know, semiconductors are probably the most important product we make in the world today. And Taiwan is at the dead center of that. As was said, Taiwan produces more than 90% of the world's most sophisticated advanced logic chips. Those are ones that are sub 10 nanometer in diameter. But it's much more than that. Taiwan produces more than 60% of all the world's semiconductors. And Taiwan is foundational to what's called the fabless foundry model. This is the notion that the US specializes usually in designing chips. So NVIDIA AI chips, Qualcomm mobile chips, AMD, Broadcom chips, right? And we do the design in America, and then those chips are outsourced to foundries in Taiwan, notably TSMC, for them to be manufactured by the world's most sophisticated manufacturing company, that being TSMC. But this disciplinarity, the symbiosis, the complementarity, you see it in the fact that American companies account for 70% of the revenues that Taiwanese foundries have. Apple alone accounts for 25% of TSMC's sales. But conversely, on the other side, if you look at US exports of semiconductor manufacturing equipment, companies like Applied Materials or Lam, 45% of their revenues come from Taiwan. So it's a symbiotic relationship up and down the ladder of semiconductor development, right? But it's not just semiconductors, right? It's the entire ICT stack. So Taiwan now manufactures 90% of the world's AI servers, over 80% of the laptops. So for the entire panoply of ICT products, we're depending on Taiwan for that. Now, we talked earlier about the complementarity hardware, software. We, in America, do well in software, right? But the reality is that 17 US companies have R&D centers on the ground in Taiwan doing the next generation technology development for things like AI, cloud computing, data centers, et cetera. So it's not just on the manufacturing side, it's on the upstream R&D design and development side that there are just these deep internal leakages at every part of the ICT ecosystem. So we can talk more about that. I know you're gonna ask Adam about that. But let me just also throw in a couple of other items here. Taiwan is also the world's leading producer of screws and metal fasteners. Taiwan is known as the bicycle kingdom. Taiwan manufactures over 70% of the world's supply of mid to high-end and precision bicycles. And I should note just two more things. One, Taiwan has become increasingly critical for the US biopharmaceutical supply chain. Taiwan recently announced a $755 million investment to advance the world-leading development of active pharmaceutical ingredients, of APIs. These are precursors that go into drugs. As we in America look to diversify away from China, Taiwan's going to be a critical component of our drug development pipeline, and also drones and defense. This has become an increasing area of innovation in Taiwan. So across a wide range of technologies beyond just electronics, the US-Taiwan relationship is critical.
Great, thanks, Stephen. And so Adam, Stephen did touch on Taiwan's role in the semiconductor supply chain. Over 90% of the world's most advanced chips are made in Taiwan. That was a point that Ambassador Lee made and that Stephen also made. But help us maybe go a level deeper on that and talk about Taiwan's role in kind of the broader AI build out that we're seeing here in the United States. I think that it was very interesting if you look at the December US trade data, Taiwan was neck and neck with China in terms of bilateral trade with the United States. It was just behind Canada and Mexico. And a lot of that is Taiwanese exports of these components that we're using for the AI build out in the United States. So how do you think about Taiwan's role in that and contextualize that within the kind of AI race that we're seeing here at home?
Yeah, sure, thanks. So yes, we've all mentioned the 80–90% advance, but also if we're looking at AI data center, semiconductor, logic semiconductors, Taiwan is producing 100% of that. So all of the big corporations are all running models on these AI semiconductors produced in Taiwan. Companies like Honhai and Quanta, Inventec and Riston are producing 90% of AI servers. So that is also a key component of it. And then Taiwan, TSMC in particular, dominates advanced packaging. So 90% of advanced packaging is happening. And advanced packaging matters for sectors that Taiwan doesn't dominate. So even with, when you're looking at a memory chip and you need to connect it to a GPU, you need the advanced packaging to play a role, and that's where Taiwan comes in as well. Taiwan still produces about 43% of legacy chips. China is gaining quickly. It's about 34%. People think it'll pass Taiwan around 2029, 2030. But when we start thinking about embodied AI, robotics, all of that is going to really play an important role.
And so if I could follow up a little bit on this aspect, I think that the debate in the United States really goes from one end of the spectrum to the other. On one hand, there is the notion that the United States will become completely independent on semiconductor manufacturing. The TSMC's investments in Arizona and elsewhere will mean that the United States will make 100% of the chips that it needs for all applications domestically. On the other side, you hear this narrative that the United States is wholly dependent on Taiwan for chips, and that is a vulnerability that is not sustainable or not strategically a wise course to take. So, between both of those poles that we look at, how do you think about this question of Taiwan's role in terms of the chip ecosystem? And if we project out to the end of this decade or something, what level do you think we're going to be at in terms of domestic manufacturing of chips versus importing those from Taiwan or from fabs that TSMC is building in Japan or elsewhere?
Yeah, I think it is a pipe dream that anyone will be completely independent of the global supply chain for semiconductor chips. I think it's true for Taiwan, it's true for the United States. The idea that we were going to totally manufacture chips without any input seems to me to be quite impossible. I think the goal, long term, is to be able to control the most important nodes of that supply chain, so you have a degree of autonomy. But I think by the end of the decade is only 4 years away. It seems to me very unlikely that the U.S. will be able to recreate what TSMC has in Taiwan. People point out that it is growing quickly. There are now 40 semiconductor-related companies around TSMC in Phoenix, but there are 500 to 600 semiconductor-related companies in Hsinchu. So recreating that kind of ecosystem is not a quick or easy thing to do. And I suspect by the time that the U.S. manages to produce what we consider the cutting edge now, that we will have moved on either to below 2 nanometer or to new substrates, to gallium or other things.
Great. And Stephen had a 2-finger before I turn to Rosalind.
A quick 2-finger. America's share of global semiconductor manufacturing declined from 37% in 1990 to 12% by 2020. This was the impetus for our Chips and Science Act that put $52 billion in industry. But even the CHIPS Act, its aim was to bring the U.S. back to 17% of global semiconductor manufacturing to meet minimum viable manufacturing capacity in the United States. So a wild success for America would be to get back to 17 to 20% in this space. I just also add, this is a 2024 number, but in 2024, it was a $480 billion global semiconductor industry, expected to grow to $1 trillion by 2030. To meet that global demand would require the creation of 65 new fabs in the world. So in no way are we taking away from Taiwan with what we're adding on the US or Europe or elsewhere. It's a pie that's growing. The US is going to get some more slices, but in no way is that going to contract the size of Taiwan's pie.
Great. So Rosalind, turning over to you. So maybe we can now broaden the discussion back out into kind of the broader geopolitical context of today. I think Courtney in her opening remark made a reference to the Strait of Hormuz. We've also seen some news reports about potential shortages of LNG in Taiwan due to the closure of the strait. Questions about, the availability of specialized gases for industrial production in not just Taiwan, but also South Korea and elsewhere in East Asia. So as you kind of zoom out and think about US-China dynamics with the summit coming up, you think about the ongoing war with Iran and the knock-on effects of that on global supply chains, what does it all mean for these high-tech supply chains that we're talking about tonight?
Yeah, hope you guys can hear me. Wanted to build a bit on my two colleagues here. We are in the age of globalization, and complex interdependence has not ended, despite what some of my fellow political scientists have called weaponized interdependence. And so the fact that Taiwan is in the United States investing in the partnerships that Ambassador Lee had talked about, in Phoenix with TSMC there, building out kind of technology production lines, and the fact that the United States companies are in, as Stephen mentioned, R&D facilities in Taiwan. That's a great example of that complex interdependence that globalization has ushered. And so we're not going to see the end of that. And in fact, I'm going to make the argument that because of the US-China tech war, in fact, more than ever, the United States and Taiwan should work closely together and to maximize the benefits of this complex interdependence. And indeed, as David had mentioned, we are in a time of major tensions, right? The geopolitics. We have US intervention, first in Latin America, and then now in Iran, in the Middle East. And US and allies around the world are affected by oil prices, delayed shipments of trade, and in particularly semiconductors. This is a very important industry that will require a lot of energy sources. And with that, the fact that we are in war will make it, it will have obviously an impact. And but it does not mean that that complex interdependence has not ended. What it does mean is that we need to work closer together. And I mentioned the U.S. tech war with China. In the context of that, the civil-military integration, dual-use technology, all of that, which I've written about, really did come as a result of actually China maximizing the benefits of globalization and trying to minimize the costs. And so what we've seen is that the Chinese government, through the years since its integration into the global economy, re-regulated, liberalized the macroeconomy, and then re-regulated at the sector level to maximize knowledge and technology transfers, and then to re-regulate to minimize costs for the development of indigenous industry. And a lot of that indigenous industry is going abroad now to the different parts of the global south, and also even to Eastern Europe and part of the advanced industrialized world as well. And so I would say that this is a time actually for the United States and Taiwan, both with investments in the United States, but also Taiwanese investments abroad and United States investments abroad to work together to confront and to address that tech competition locally around the world, at places that China is at, not just within the United States or in Taiwan. And so the strategic value of semiconductors is more than ever important for this US-China-Taiwan relationship. We have at the technology level where we are seeing technological exchanges between Taiwan via TSMC, but also the entire ecosystem where other Taiwanese companies and American companies are in collaboration with each other in the United States, in Taiwan, but in also other places these TSMC and other companies are. And we are seeing the strategic value of semiconductors at the institutional level. And that is institutional level in that ecosystem, that up and down the supply chain. And that is both at the kind of development manufacturing, research and development manufacturing dimension, but also in the trade infrastructure, the global supply chain trade infrastructure, that could still be built out. And that's a place where Taiwanese government and the United States government could really play a big role. And then finally, the strategic value of Taiwanese semiconductors, I would say, is at the trust that has been built at the ideational value latent level. The trust that has been built within the semiconductor industry. Jensen Huang recently had said that there are 3 reasons why NVIDIA works closely with TSMC. And it is indeed at these 3 different dimensions I just mentioned. For TSMC's technology, for industrial operations that TSMC has mastered over the years in working up and down the supply chain, and also making sure every nook and every node works in favor of their customers. And then also finally, Jensen Huang said that NVIDIA works with TSMC, and I would say really with Taiwanese semiconductor industry writ large, is that the trust. The trust built on democratic values. And NVIDIA actually revealed the fact that apparently NVIDIA doesn't even actually have a contract with TSMC. And so not that 30 years of trust relationship it's quite critical, and I feel, and indeed Taiwan is an important, can play an important role in that, that tech competition with China. And so indeed, the strategic value of the Taiwanese semiconductor industry is very much part of how the United States should continue to maximize the benefits of complex interdependence and not enter into weaponized interdependence.
All right, so thus far we've focused a lot on the analytical side. So I want to shift briefly to the prescriptive side before we open it up to everybody. So if you do have a question, please get ready, because I'll open it up to the audience soon. But you know, I think Ambassador Lee mentioned one thing that has consistently loomed here and seems like low-hanging fruit, but is never actually picked, which is the double taxation agreement, which has yet to be passed between the United States and Taiwan. But I'm wondering if I could put each of you on the spot in terms of thinking through what tangible policy prescriptions or recommendations would you put forward in this area for the United States and Taiwan to work together on the high-tech supply chains. I mean, so again, as Ambassador Lee said, Taiwan is going to commit $250 billion of investments to the United States, potentially $250 billion of additional credit guarantees. There's a lot of talk about, of course, TSMC's investment in Arizona, but beyond that, what are some areas of potential bilateral cooperation that you think could be deepened or further explored, or that should be you know, in terms of more ambitious areas? Maybe I'll start with you, Adam, and then I'll work my way down.
So, of course, the sexiest topic right now is drones. I would say that, you know, Anduril has started to do some cooperation with National Zhongshan Science and Tech Center. But as, you know, Stephen mentioned, all of the high-tech manufacturing around screws and bicycles and other things, and the U.S. struggles on that side. And is going to continue to struggle in that. And the war in Iran shows, you know, how quickly we can run through stock of all types of weapon systems. So I think any types of concrete cooperation on the manufacturing side, and you know, looking at U.S. what we call, you know, neoprimes now. So the new wave of venture-backed defense tech companies, and how they can both match up with, you know, similar companies emerging in Taiwan. I think there's been some reform on the Taiwanese side about how do you change procurement structures so that they can play more of a role. So making sure that those are more compatible.
Great, yeah, and I think actually just last week, Senator Ted Cruz introduced legislation on US-Taiwan cooperation or collaboration on drone manufacturing and drone supply chains. I think, you know, there was an article 2 weeks ago or so in The Economist that reported that Taiwan exported something like 130,000 drones last year, most of them going to Europe for essentially use in Ukraine, and that I think those drones are the only ones in the world now with close to zero Chinese parts or technology. So that does seem like that's an area for potential US-Taiwan cooperation. So Rosalind, what else would you put on the table?
Something that's been mentioned, and I think it needs to be more robust, is the trade infrastructure. And trade infrastructure specifically across different market segments and sectors that are involved in the manufacturing of these really important equipment for areas of collaboration. So aside from the, continue to work on the trade infrastructure, also industry level exchanges and standard setting. I think Taiwan really could be more involved and participate in more industry level standard setting, and that will really also be able to go head to head and toe to toe with China at the global levels there. And then also firm to firm collaborations definitely should continue. There was continued bipartisan, the recent bipartisan kind of porcupine policy that was passed, which designated Taiwan as a NATO plus country, which I think is a step forward to put Taiwan in markets and trade in Eastern Europe. So it would be great for Taiwan to be involved in regional-based trade infrastructure as well, and to bring it to the industry level and the firm level. These are some ideas.
Stephen?
All right, I'm going to give you my big theory of this. Last year, 36% of US semiconductor sales went to China. 48% of Japan's semiconductor sales went to China. It was in the 40% for Taiwan. But what we have to recognize is that China wants that share nothing more than to be 0%. And in fact, it is the avowed goal of the newest 5-year plan to make China 75% self-sufficient in semiconductor production in the next decade. The critical thing to note is that across all high-tech industries, electric vehicles, solar panels, high-speed rail, semiconductors, China wants autarky. But how do we deal with the situation that our companies in these critical industries depend for 40% on the revenues of China, but they're doing all they can to make it 0? And the only way we can help our companies out of that box is if we intentionally re-architect the global economic game board, so that in a decade we can say, we only have to sell 10 to 15% of these products to China. Why and how? Because we've built up the technology ecosystem of making high-tech goods from airplanes to semiconductors in friendly allied countries across the world, across the rest of Southeast Asia, India, Central America. And that's why initiatives that we're just starting to toy with, like Pax Silica, where we bring together a select group of companies to say, let's collaborate on all levels of the AI stack in that case, from critical minerals to the semiconductors to the servers. We have to be thinking, to your point about the trade architecture, of redesigning the global game board in our economic favor, not just leaving it to markets. Markets work great in a lot of cases, but China is going to play jujitsu against us, so we have to go on all that. But I would just say, to close that thought, that's why it's so important that the US re-engage in efforts like the CPTPP, the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Because if we abandon that, we let China make the rules of the road for the global high-tech economy. We've got to get back in the game there. Taiwan, hopefully you get in the CPTPP. We need to come behind you. Other areas like the WTO e-commerce customs duty moratorium, which expired after 30 years in Yaoundé, Cameroon last week, the information technology agreement. There's much we can do, as you said, Rosalind, to build this trade infrastructure in the mutual interest of both our nations and our corporations.
Great. I'll open it now to our audience. When I call on you, just please very briefly identify yourself and ask your question. You can direct it at one of the panelists as well. So, yes.
Thank you. My name is Tara Hariharan. I work for a hedge fund here in New York, and I'm very familiar with Adam and David's work because I'm also a member at the Council on Foreign Relations. My question pertains to what is perhaps one of the most critical choke points right now for the semiconductor industry, namely critical minerals. And as I'm given to understand, Taiwan also, like pretty much the rest of the world, is very dependent on Chinese supply of rare earths and other inputs. So in terms of, again, going back to the subject matter of the talk today, What is right now being done, apart from this general talk, of course, of critical minerals cooperation and such, for the US to help safeguard Taiwan's supply of critical minerals? And also, I mean, going back to the Strait of Hormuz, we talk about energy and the energy shortage, but there's also things like helium, for instance, that also significantly factor into the chip supply chain. So just curious as to how the US and Taiwan, both currently and also prescriptively, you think, can work together to secure these supply chains. Thank you.
Great. Who wants to take that?
I mean, so right now, Taiwan is signaled a bilateral agreement about Pax Silica, but is not an official member, if I understand correctly. So has signed on to the principles of it. I guess Secretary Heilberg, Undersecretary Heilberg, announced a new sovereign wealth fund also for investment that Taiwan does not seem to be a part of as well. So those are all things that are not happening. And I think probably the most likely parts where we can bring Taiwan in right now are forward-looking, so kind of innovation around reuse and new technologies to reduce demand as opposed to actual supply chain issues for the current ones, given that the Trump administration doesn't seem to be, or at least right now, and this all may be on hold because of the summit. Maybe after the summit there'll be some movement on it, but right now it seems pretty unwilling to talk about Taiwan as an active partner in it.
You know, my view on this is the only way we're going to deal with China's dominance of not just the refining, not the mining, but the refining and processing. Why they're so good at it, right? Because they use extremely environmentally unfriendly methods. They use low-cost labor. So the only way we're going to get ourselves out of that box is through innovation, to create new environmentally friendly, technologically driven refining processes. And this is where I think we should have an allied consortium between Taiwan, Japan, Korea, United States. We need to co-invest to fund the PhDs at universities in these countries to come up with the new chemistries to deal with that problem. Only chemistry, technology, and innovation is going to get us out of that challenge. And by the way, what does China dominate EVs? Well, because they have the entire stack all the way down to the mines in Congo, so they can get the materials cheaply at low cost. They can innovate for new battery chemistries. And you know, now they're doing, you saw Thailand Energy, a new battery that does 1,000 kilometers off a 5-minute charge. US is not even in the picture.
Great. There's also the theory that AI is going to solve our critical mineral dependence by inventing new materials that we don't even need China for the inputs. So we can also put all of our eggs in the AI basket for that. Anyone else in our audience want to ask a question of the panelists up here? Yes, Aaron.
Hi. Hi, thank you. Aaron Glasserman, University of Pennsylvania, Center for the Study of Contemporary China. So I have a question for Stephen. Twice in your comments now, you've raised things, both the calling for the re-entry into TPP, or entry into TPP, and then university funding from the federal government, both of which seem just extremely politically impossible right now, for lack of a better word, in the United States. And so I'm wondering, what do you think could be done to either forestall, like make this more possible in the longer run, or what is a sort of more immediately plausible thing that could be done now to get us at least on that path, in your view?
I was given a presentation on Capitol Hill a couple of years ago. We do a study that uses OECD data to look at how much governments fund universities as share of R&D. US is like 34th out of 39 OECD countries. Anyway, after my presentation, one of the congressional staffers raises his hand and says, Mr. Ezell, how much does America, the government, spend on R&D every year? I was like, well, you know, it depends on the year, but about 130 to 140 billion dollars. And he says, oh my God, are you serious? We're going to cut that out. It's a real phenomena in Washington, D.C., and of a younger generation that they just simply do not understand this quota, that the investments that one generation make represent the seed corns of the jobs and occupations and technologies of the future. And you see this. I mean, the initial Trump budget cut 55% from NSF and 38% for NIH. Now, Congress restored most of that. It was just a couple percentage points down. But you know, this is why it's important that us, the public that cares about these issues, are communicating with our policymakers in Washington, you know, to say that, you know, there was a whole report from R Street Institute last week about how government investment in R&D crowds out private sector in R&D investment. That's the exact opposite of what the economic literature shows. Public investment crowds in private sector investment. So I don't think there's more of an answer than we got to talk to policymakers in this country of all stripes and all colors to say, this is foundational. And now if we're going to talk about a US-China geotech competition, global tech war, the last thing we should be now is cutting the R&D that's going to be essential to our ability to compete in these industries in the future.
Great. Ling Ling.
I mean, I'll just say, I think, look, there still seems to be in the Republican Party, even though there are, you know, massive divisions between what the Hill wants and what the White House wants and parts of the White House, there still seems to be enough Congress people and senators who have this vision of competing with China that involves scale, allies, investment in our own resources. Now, you know, what happens after the midterms? Is Congress in more of a place to push back against what the White House? We certainly know that on a lot of these issues on investment in NIH, for example, Congress tends not to go along with the White House cuts because they do see long-term value, especially in investment in health. I mean, I agree with you. Short term, it certainly doesn't look like there's a lot of support for it, but it could be longer term that those coalitions come back together again after, you know, what happens after the midterms.
Great. Ling Ling.
David, thank you so much. Ling Ling Wei with the Wall Street Journal. Great panel. I have a question for maybe all three of you. So as the US and Taiwan implement this 2026 strategic semiconductor agreement, how do you think both sides can balance the addition and multiplication of US domestic capacity against the risk of hollowing out Taiwan's silicon shield? Thank you.
Sure. Rosalind?
You know, I think all of us have talked about that interdependence, right? I think that just because there's Taiwanese investment in the United States doesn't mean that there aren't these other kind of parts of the value chain that also in the semiconductor you know, sector up and down the supply chain. And so in that sense, Taiwanese, the hollowing out is more imaginary and maybe expectant, but likely not going to happen. New collaborations and new partnerships could emerge from this new partnership. And instead of it kind of the hollowing out imagery, we could see it as maybe a silicon wave where you know, more and more kind of rippling effects across the United States and Taiwan. This is how I foresee an investment in, you know, of Taiwanese investment into the United States, and what might flower from that.
Does anyone else want to talk about the silicon shield and U.S. Kind of reshoring or onshoring versus, you know, Taiwan's own capabilities?
I mean, so I think the point that there are several points that suggest that the balancing will happen somewhat naturally. I mean, one is, as Stephen said, that the pie will grow so that everybody will be selling more. Two, I think, you know, there is a real question about how much, you know, as Stephen said, a success would be for the US to go to 20%. So that doesn't sound like hollowing out to Taiwan. We haven't mentioned workforce issues. So, you know, training people and having the people on the ground in the States, I think will be a natural limit to how fast that all is built out. So I think the balancing will happen somewhat on its own, and there won't be necessarily as much adjustment. And then the question is, to Stephen's point about innovation for the next, what comes after silicon, right? And where that falls, and if the U.S. manages to make breakthroughs in gallium or some other place, that also, I think, resolves a lot of the problem.
I'll just say one thing very brief. I'll take the prerogative as the moderator and then turn it over to you, Stephen. But I think that the narrative on the silicon shield, as has been pointed out here, I mean, Taiwan is not going to lose its edge in semiconductor manufacturing. The most advanced chips will always be made in Taiwan. That's at least what TSMC says. That's what the Taiwan government says. And just given how large the pie is getting and growing, even if the TSMC investments in Arizona are wildly successful, I think that the percentage that Taiwan produces of the most advanced chips will stay around the same, kind of where it's at. I actually view the silicon shield narrative as much more an outgrowth of general skepticism of the United States that we see in Taiwan. I think if you didn't have the skepticism of the United States, you wouldn't have these questions about hollowing out of Taiwan. I think it's a manifestation of the deep concern that we see, and this is reflected in public polling, that the United States is not a reliable or trustworthy country. And of course, it doesn't help when the United States is holding arms sales for summits with Xi Jinping, or questions are swirling about the United States changing its declaratory policy on Taiwan. So one way to get at the narrative of a hollowing out of Taiwan is to do more on the other aspects of the relationship to reassure Taiwan that US commitments are not just about chips. Because as we all know, the Taiwan Relations Act was passed in 1979 before the semiconductor was even a thing. And US interests transcend chips. So I think that we get caught up a lot in thinking about this relationship as being one-dimensional, when actually it is far deeper, and US interests, in my view at least, transcend chips. And so I would just say that. So Stephen?
If I may, just really quickly on the politics, I think some of that also has to do with domestic Taiwanese politics, right? The partisan politics between the DPP and the KMT, and so that plays a big role in kind of enlarging the myth as well.
And I was just going to add, where there's a hole in the shield is around talent. As I understand, the number of Taiwanese PhD STEM students that travel to the United States in their studies has declined 40% since 2000. It's down 20% in the other way from Taiwan to the US. We have a shortage of 100,000 skilled technicians and engineers for our semiconductor workforce. I know in Taiwan that the share of students going into PhD STEM fields has also decreased. So I think on the workforce and the talent side, this is going to be an area where there's going to be opportunity for increased collaboration between the United States and Taiwan to deal with that particular challenge. Because we kind of take the manufacturing for granted, we throw on their stats, but the ecosystem that supports it is also critical, and we can't forget about that.
Okay, I think we're at about time, but if we have any final questions, we can put that to the panel. Ray, Ambassador Burghardt in the front.
Hi, Ray Burkhardt, consultant to IDA, Institute for Defense Analyses, and former director of American Institute Taiwan in Taipei and Washington. Just following up on the silicon shield subject, my TSMC friends always say that the very latest generation of chips has to be developed in Taiwan because of the nature of the process. You have literally thousands of engineers involved. And every stage of the R&D process, there's an elaborate testing that goes on that uses hundreds of engineers to do that testing. The idea of moving that process to Arizona or Kuromoto or somewhere is pretty far-fetched. Do you buy that explanation of why it would be hard to move the R&D to somewhere else?
Adam, do you want to take that?
I do. I mean, I think looking at the innovation process, specifically around advanced chips, but even more broadly, it's very hard to relocate an ecosystem at the cutting edge, right? The support for those systems is is, as you said, it's not like you move 30 people from one lab in Hsinchu to Phoenix. You need to have all the other people around who do the testing, the iteration, that have the tacit knowledge about all of the specs and everything else like that. So that sounds inherently right to me.
And when it's $32 billion for the newest fab, you're going to do it on your home turf.
I think we had one last question in the back.
Thank you. Julian Koo from Hofstra University. I want to think big picture, because it seems to me that if there had not been an AI revolution, the chip story would be smaller than it is. And so I wonder if we think future, like down the road in 10 years, do we think that the supply chain will be as tightly integrated and Taiwan will be economically as important to the US technology industry as it is today? Or is that naturally going to decrease over time? And could other developments that we can't quite understand change that? If suppose quantum computing, would that change the nature of how much the chips are important and which kind of chips we need? Or maybe something else. So I was curious whether each of the panelists has a sense of how confident are you in the long term that this supply chain relationship will maintain itself in the way it is now?
I'll take a stab at that. Let's say there's no AI. Let's say we have COVID. Well, you know what still happens? We have the semiconductor shortage, which led to the production of 13 million fewer vehicles in North America in the year 2021. That wouldn't otherwise have been the case. Knocked off half a percentage point of US GDP and drove up US inflation by 1 percentage point. That's in a world with no AI at all, because the semiconductor is critical for the vehicle, right? So my point is, semiconductors are critical for absolutely every connected thing in the world now, from buses to medical devices to toaster ovens, to all these AI systems. So I think one can draw an argument that even in a world of no AI, the need for this product is not going away. Now, what's interesting, if you really get into it, right, is TSMC dominates today, right? I mean, but we may get into a world of more neuromorphic computing, right? DNA-based computing. Quantum computing. So I think the more interesting question is the current semiconductor architecture that TSMC is dominant at. Will that still be the case in 50 years? Because rest assured, in China and all around the world, they're trying to disintermediate TSMC with entirely new computing architectures.
So my own sense, just very briefly, is that the focus on chips predates AI, and as Stephen said, was very much a result of the shortages of the COVID-19 pandemic, which was kind of a wake-up call to policymakers just how much we rely on these chips for everything from microwaves to automobiles to basically everything we use in our daily lives. And I would say that actually my reading at least is that the CHIPS Act was spurred in large part by concerns about where we get chips from and how reliable our supply of chips would be for our weapon systems and national security applications during a potential contingency in the Indo-Pacific. And so that's obviously pre-AI as well, but I think if you listen to, for instance, Secretary Raimondo during the Biden administration, she emphasized just how many chips are in a single Javelin missile, right? None of which are made in the United States. And so I think if you're looking at worst case scenarios and planning for potential contingencies, there was a sense that there needed to be some level of production in the United States to at least address that concern, and that's before we even get into AI. So I think AI has catapulted Taiwan, as I said before, to now being just in line with China in terms of trading partners, right behind Canada and Mexico. That, of course, would not happen absent AI, but I still think that there would be a big push on the chips front without the developments in the AI space. So with that, please join me in thanking our panelists for tonight.